Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be going through some key details with our creative writing. Specifically what we're going to be focusing on is understanding how to use language to create an effective opening. Look at the images and attempt the challenges that follow. So the first picture we have then is one of an eye, then we have a bottle, and we have some numbers drawn on a chalkboard. So the first thing I'd like to think about is the very first challenge: what language techniques are the images referring to? And I'd like to try and attempt the super challenge and think about why is this important to use in your creative writing. Now if you want to spend a bit of time, pause the video here and write down your answers, please feel free to do so. We're now going to think about having a bit of feedback and revealing what the answers are. Class feedback. Check your answers against the ones below. So as you can see there with the image on the right hand side, the technique that we're talking about is sensory language. If you're not too sure what we mean by sensory language, we mean using sight, hearing, smell, taste and touch, all to have a positive impact on our reader. So it's important to include in our writing sensory language as it allows the audience to experience the world you're creating for them. Without this, they can't fully understand what you're writing. So in order to create an effective opening and actually help your reader to be immersed within the world that you're creating, we absolutely have to be using the sensory language within our writing. Now in terms of what we're going to be focusing on today, our big picture is going to be being able to recall the importance of sensory language. You're going to be able to understand how to construct an effective opening, and finally apply your understanding to a creative writing project. Now in terms of this creative writing project, what we're going to be thinking about is trying to construct something over the next few lessons. So for this project, what we're going to do, we're going to produce, edit and improve a piece of creative writing for academic success. When we say academic success, really we're going to be thinking about question 5 for paper 1. So a little bit more about the project then. So each week we'll focus on a key skill. These will help you to gradually write a creative response. We will draft and redraft to produce a high-level response for paper 1, question 5. Now before we move on and start thinking about how to create an effective opening, I like to just try to think, pair and share. And you can try and share your comments there below if you want to, or you can also start up a Teams chat as well to try and talk it through as well. So how would you feel about creative writing? What are some of the challenges and issues that you have faced with question 5 in the past? This is a really important question because it's half the marks in your exam, but it's also one that a lot of people really struggle with. So what are some of the things that we find a little bit tricky, a little bit difficult? If you can actually vocalize them and share your ideas, it's going to give us a really good idea on what we need to develop and work on within our future lessons. As we said before earlier on in the video, the main thing we're going to focus on is our sensory language. Primarily what we're going to think about now is we're going to look at 3 different sound clips, and each of these are going to help you to think about the kind of atmosphere or even the setting that we're going to be writing about. So at the moment we're not actually going on a picture, we're just going to think about what can we hear in each of these 3 sound clips, and you're going to try and respond to each question in the boxes to try and actually help formulate an image or an idea about what we need to be writing about. As we go through them as well, it would be really important if you could try and stretch and challenge yourselves. Use the sound effects to predict what might happen in the story, and you can use all of this when it comes to creating your own response. So as we look through the first one then, sound clip 1, these are the questions that you need to answer. So what could the weather be like? Come up with 2 or more adjectives to describe what you hear. So we need at least 2 words to describe the actual sounds that are coming through. When we get onto sound clip number 2, we need to think about what kind of vehicle can you hear and how would you describe how it moves in bad weather conditions. Don't just say that it sounds, really loud or something like that. Try and think about being a little bit more creative, a little bit more inventive. Really think about the sounds that is coming through and think about the best way to describe it to help your reader really understand the sounds and the description that's coming through. For the third one, sound clip number 3, we need to think about what item is the main character holding and how could this sound help build tension. Okay, so the first one we're going to start off with then is sound clip number 1. If you need to pause the video at any point and take your time to go through these questions and really think carefully about the things you're hearing, please feel free to do so. So that was someone actually moving through the kind of environment that's been created by some really bad weather. So think very carefully about the questions that are in the box. Think about how you could describe what you've just heard, and then when you're ready, move on to sound clip number 2. Okay, we're moving on to our third and final sound clip then. So again, we need to think about what item is the main character holding and how could this sound help build tension. Now this one's probably the hardest one, so you have to think really carefully about the kind of environment that's being created and the kind of item that you might be carrying at the moment. So typically if it's bad weather, it might lead to something that is important during that time, or he might also be out there for more sinister reasons. Why would he actually go out there and brave the really bad weather in order to actually go out there and do something? So what's the purpose that's actually brought him there? So I'm going to leave it there in terms of the sound clips. If you do need to go back over them, please feel free to drag the video back a little bit and listen to them again. Try and use your imaginations as much as possible and try and think how have those actual sensory descriptions helped us to understand what might be happening in the story. So there, so far we've had bad weather. You can hear that it's someone walking in the snow. Sound clip 2 was obviously of a car going through some quite tight bends or quite tight turns. And if you haven't figured it out for sound 3 yet, that is actually supposed to be the sound of someone loading or reloading a gun. So we've got potentially quite a sinister story as well. Look at the image and attempt the challenges that follow. So this is a very typical picture that you might get for paper 1, question 5, where you're given an image and you're asked to write a description or an opening of a story based on around what you can see. The first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to try and mind map 3 or more adjectives to describe the image. Then if you can move on to the super challenge, I'd like to think about what would be an effective opening for this bit of writing. So think about the kind of techniques that make the writing effective, the kind of things that would get you marks in the exam, and also think about using that sensory language that we covered earlier, and how can you embed that to create an effective opening. And then when you're ready, what we're going to do, we're going to attempt the mega challenge. So look at the response on the next slide. I want you to think about, is it a good opening? What kind of things would make it effective? And then try and justify your answer. Look at the student response and identify any aspects that are successful and anything that needs changing or adapting. So here we have a student's response. It's their first attempt at this one. So when it comes to our first attempt, it's not always going to be the best thing in the world. Think about the kind of things that you normally produce in class. Think about the kind of things that you know make writing effective and try and apply it to this response that we've got in front of us. So it says then, there was the sound of snow crunching as people walked, desperate to get home before the weather took a turn for the worstest. The snow was really, really cold. It attacked the people walking on the street, defeating the thin layers of their clothing. There was a car that was screeching down the road and sounded really loud. The driver was being really dangerous and skidding all over the place. As the car raced away into the distance, the only sound that could be heard was the sound of a gun being loaded. So if you'd like to pause the video here and go through it at your own time, please feel free to do so. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at the feedback that was actually given by their teacher and understand what worked well and the things it needs to do to improve and get a higher mark. Class feedback. Check your answers against the teacher's comments. So here on the left hand side what we have is the response that we just went through, and on the right hand side we also have the feedback that was given by the teacher. Now the first thing to note about this is that the teacher has wrote www, and in this case we mean what went well. So these are the things that are going to make the writing successful and are going to get it a few marks within the exam. So first thing they've identified then is the response has started to use sensory language. So we can see that when we look at the response, the very first line in fact, we have the sound of snow crunching as people walked. So that does work quite well, especially when you think about the sound that we looked at in a previous part of the video. We also have the car screeching down the road. So that's quite effective there in that sensory language. Not only is it telling us that the car is being quite loud, but also that word screeching is really effective in being able to tell us the sound that's being made. The next thing they've said then, some language techniques have been used to make the writing engaging. So if you think about the typical techniques that are going to be effective, we need to think about things like our sensory language, which would be a language technique. But really, in order to get a higher mark, we need to be thinking about more engaging techniques. So that is why when you look at the feedback, instead of saying they've used many or a judicious range, instead we get words like some or started. Now all of this implies that even though the learner has started to use some of these good techniques and they're kind of on the right track, they're not really where they need to be in order to get full marks for the exam response. EBI, so this stands for even better if. So these are the kind of comments that we need to take into account in order to change, amend, edit and adapt our writing to make sure we can get an improvement and get a few more marks in the exam. So the first thing they pointed out there is that there are a number of spelling and grammatical errors, and these are quite frequent really, and that is really going to impact your mark. So if you think about that overall marks that you get for question 5, there's a total of 40 marks for this question, half of the exam paper. For the technical accuracy, so that's like your spelling, your grammar and your punctuation, that's 16 marks. So if you're not very good at your spelling or your grammar or your punctuation, then that's a really important area that we need to make sure that we're addressing when we do our writing. The next part then, the response hasn't used all of the 5 senses. Yes, they've started to, because we have had some times where they've used the senses of actually hearing things, but they haven't developed it and they haven't engaged the other senses that we looked at the start of the lesson. A range of language techniques are needed in order to achieve a higher mark for this question. So when you think about question 5, you need to be showing off to the examiner, you need to be showing them that you know how to apply all of these techniques that you've learned over your course and that you can apply it to your own creative writing to create a really effective response. Now that we've looked at the first response, let's think about how we respond to feedback. Now, a lot of the time when people show other people their creative writing, sometimes they can feel a little bit awkward because it is quite a personal thing that you're showing someone else, right? It's something you've spent a lot of time and a lot of effort going through. When you think about the first attempt in learning, the most important thing to think about is that really this is classed as our fail attempt. And you can see there that we've got fail. If you actually take each of the individual letters, we should think about it like this. So our first attempt is your fail attempt, right? It's the one that we know isn't going to be perfect. So the first attempt at your creative writing won't be perfect. There may be some positives, as we've seen with the response that we've just looked at, but there'll also be many ways to improve the response and get a higher grade. It doesn't matter if you're just new to creative writing or if you've been doing it for 10 or 20 years. Everyone who writes will find that some of their writing will need improvement. So there's nothing wrong with looking back over it and accepting there are some things that need to be changed and adapted to make it more successful. When we have our feedback, that is when we use it and we have our second attempt in learning. So that is where we sail. That is where we really go out on our own and we are able to succeed in our writing. So the second attempt in learning is where you receive your feedback from a teacher or someone else in your class or a peer, and you use this to improve your writing in the second attempt. So we're not after making a complete masterpiece. The main thing with looking at your work, editing it and improving it is that you understand the things that work well and that you're able to build on these so that you turn the rest of your response into something that's much more successful than the first attempt you made. Now if we look at the response the learner has done after they've received their feedback, we're going to get a good indication of where this writing is going. So if they've managed to take on board that feedback and actually make some valid improvements. So we have a very similar response to the one we started at, but instead it's our second attempt in learning. So the learner's gone away, they've made changes and they've adapted their writing. So instead it's going to read something like this. There was the sound of snow crunching as people walked, desperate to get home before the weather took a turn for the worst. The snow was relentlessly cold. It attacked the people walking on the street, defeating the thin layers of their clothing. There was a car that was screeching down the road, the heat from its tires sending ribbons of smoke into the cold air. The driver struggled to wrestle the car into submission as he tried desperately to control the vehicle. As the car raced away into the distance, the only sound that could be heard was the sound of a gun being loaded. Now, even though this response isn't going to be the most amazing response, not necessarily anyway when we have our second attempt, we can see from the response, from the areas that are in blue, that the candidate has actually read their feedback and they've gone back and they've made some changes, and it sounds so much better than the first attempt. So we're not after perfection, we're after understanding the certain areas that need to be improved, addressing them, and then building from that and growing as a writer. So even though you have to do it for an exam purpose, the aim should be to be improving yourself in terms of your ability at producing your creative writing. Using everything we have covered in today's lesson, attempt the following challenges. So the first thing I'd like you to do, I'd like you to try and write the opening of a story or a description of a cold, wintry landscape. Now you can use the picture that we looked at the start of the lesson if you want to. If you'd rather find a different picture yourself, then that's fine. As long as it's quite a cold, wintry landscape, you can use whichever one you want. That's absolutely fine. Then I'd like to think about the super challenge. So use sensory language to make your writing engaging. Think about how you can really use that to engage the reader, hook them in, and really immerse them with the writing you're producing. The mega challenge. Use the following examples of ambitious vocabulary. So as we know from our previous lessons, in order to get a really high mark, we have to think about our words choice. We need to think about the adjectives that we're using in our writing. So the ones that we've been thinking about the last few lessons are things like peril, malice, and fury. Now we have looked at those in previous lessons. If you're not too sure what we mean by them, please feel free to go away, look them up, use a dictionary or even your phones to try and figure out the definitions of them. If you are struggling to start, then you can use the ideas in the previous examples to help you. There's nothing wrong with taking a little bit of inspiration from one that you've seen before and trying to get your own spin or your own creative version of an example that's similar to that one. Now, if you are able to do this, we're not looking at writing loads and loads at the moment. You'd aim to produce somewhere around 200 to 250 words. Now, it's not about the quantity, it's about the quality. Really try and focus on your writing and try and use those techniques that we've covered in the lessons to actually make it really effective. Now, once you've done that, the aim of the game would be to swap your work and to have some feedback from someone else within your group. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the success criteria to try and give them actionable feedback. And what we mean by actionable feedback is feedback they can actually use to go and make their writing more successful and actually go on to produce their SAIL attempt, so their second attempt in learning. So in your response, these are the kind of things that we need to be looking for. So have you used sensory language to engage the reader? Have you structured your response appropriately? So have you used paragraphs and have you tried to vary your sentence structure? Have you used sophisticated vocabulary? So again, like the ones that we looked at in the challenge on the previous part. And finally, have you used a good standard of spelling, punctuation, and grammar? Now, these are generally the fundamental skills that you need when it comes to producing a really successful piece of creative writing. Now, if you've managed to get through all of that, then that's absolutely fantastic. Well done. The last thing I'd like you to think about is the exit ticket. So attempt the questions to demonstrate your understanding and to make sure we've actually got something out of what we went through today. So first thing to think about would be, what is meant by sensory language? Number two, what are two pieces of advice you would give someone about creative writing? And the final one, number three, look back at the feedback given for peer assessment. Set yourself a target for your next piece of creative writing. So really try and take on board what they've said, right? If there's an area that you need to improve, then make that your target. The whole point of this is not about producing something that's perfect on the first time. It's about coming back, developing those skills, and making sure that when the exam does come around, that we're all going to be fully prepared and happy about doing our creative writing. All the best, guys. Thanks for listening. And if you do need anything, please feel free to get in touch. Thanks. Bye.